At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too. Good evening, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, bringing you greetings once again from the planet Malibu. And welcoming you to the latest edition of our Moral Sense in Politics and Policy Evening Conversation series. As my program heads into its 20th anniversary, this series is named for one of our founders, the late, great social scientist, Dr. James Q. Wilson, a man who understood so well that effective public policy should incorporate all of the liberal arts, including history, sociology, economics, and philosophy, along with the more quantitative aspects of policymaking. More than most experts, Wilson taught that humility was a policymaker's greatest virtue, to consider what government and policy could do and what it can't. Which is why it's such a logical pleasure to co-host tonight's discussion with historian Ron White at the launch of his new biography of U.S. Grant, American Ulysses. More than most great men, Grant rarely seemed to forget that as brilliant a strategist and policymaker as he was, there were many forces beyond his control which would determine the success or failure of his decisions. In his first sentence of his magisterial autobiography, Grant writes, and I quote, "Man proposes and God disposes. There are but few important events in the affairs of men brought about by their own choice," unquote. Later, as he looked back on his service in the Mexican War, Grant remembered an Ohio Congressman, Thomas L. Hamer, who had not only made possible Grant's appointment at West Point, but was then serving as his major in an Ohio regiment. Calling him, quote, "one of the ablest men Ohio ever produced," unquote, Grant notes with sadness Hamer's death due to illness before they reached Monterrey, Mexico. Then Grant writes this, quote, "I've always believed that had his life been spared, he would have been President of the United States during the term filled by President Pierce. Had Hamer filled that office, his partiality for me was such, there is little doubt I should have been appointed one of the staff corps of the Army, the pay department probably, and would therefore now be preparing to retire," unquote. Grant concludes sublimely, quote, "Neither of these speculations is unreasonable, and they are mentioned to show how little men control their own destiny." Suffice it to say, this is not how most graduate policy programs talk about public leadership. To many of them, rational beings are controlled by rational policies. A plus B always equals C. In its best light, this approach to policy is a technocratic effort where variables such as place, culture, and faith are not considered because they can't be quantified. At its worst, this view is a centralized top-down process, which relies on, quote, "the stupidity of the American voter." Since our founding, we at Pepperdine School of Public Policy have taken a different approach to educating public leaders, and it's a perspective we share with our co-host this evening, the Trinity Forum. At the core of both of our organizations is the belief that God moves in the affairs of men and women, that unintended consequences are real, and that there is such a thing as a calling to public service. So it is once again a great honor and pleasure to introduce once again my partner in crime for tonight's Moral Sense in Politics and Policy conversation, the president of the Trinity Forum, Cherie Harder.
Many thanks for that, Pete. And I just wanted to add my own welcome to each of you to tonight's evening conversation on Ron White's new book, American Ulysses, a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. As Pete noted, this is part of an ongoing series that Trinity Forum and Pepperdine have entered into on the moral sense of politics and policy. And over the last few years, we've covered a number of topics, really quite remarkable in their breadth: the strange persistence of guilt in a post-religious world, the friendship and shared war experience of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and how it molded and shaped their imagination and life work, the link between injustice and poverty and how to break it, the link between authority and vulnerability in cultivating human flourishing. And of course, tonight we're going to look at a real-life example of how a moral sense plays out, not only in politics and policy, but in presidential leadership. So we're grateful for our friends at Pepperdine, Pete Peterson and others, as well as the other sponsors that have helped make tonight possible, including New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and we're very pleased to have John O'Brien and Theo Brown join us, National Presbyterian Church, and we have David and Curry Winwick and Quinn and Nancy Fox here. Thanks for coming. And the Lincoln Group of DC, represented tonight by John Aliff. Thank you to all of you for your support and your sponsorship. We're also delighted that brand spanking new Trinity Forum trustee Richard Miles is here with his son Christian. And we're also joined, I believe, by a delegation of U.S. Senate pages as well as students from the American Studies program. Of course, we're also thrilled that each and every one of you is here. And if you have friends who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't make it for whatever reason, we will be posting video to our site, www.ttf.org. We'll also be adding video, photos, and the like to our Facebook page that you can access or follow along at #TrinityForum. I know there are many people here tonight where this is their first time at a Trinity Forum event. And if you're not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this through several ways, both by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature that explore enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs like this one tonight, to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions of life and ultimately coming to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the big questions of life pertains to how character is formed or reformed, how we understand what makes a good person and a good leader of others. And perhaps the best way of grappling with such questions is through story and example. Our speaker tonight has led most of his life doing just that, researching and reflecting on the character, words, and works of great leaders, how to understand their story and learn from their example. And so in a new biography, he considers one of America's most determined and misunderstood presidents, the relationships, the challenges, the circumstances that shaped his character, the largely untold story of his faith, his willingness to be overlooked or misunderstood in pursuit of a greater goal, and how such factors contributed not only to military victories, but to leadership in one of the most riven and polarized periods in all of American history. He offers a new interpretation of Ulysses S. Grant as a generous, faithful, and reflective man, and a remarkable, if embattled, leader with a great adeptness at managing egos, a readiness to address the most challenging of national problems, and a willingness to sacrifice his personal popularity to do so. This retelling, which General Petraeus called a monumental examination of one of the most compelling figures in American history, and Pulitzer Prize winner John Meacham called an invaluable restoration of Grant to the pantheon of great leaders, not only offers a compelling study of the character and skill of a frequently maligned leader, but also, by implication, raises questions about the importance of character in presidential leadership in our own polarized time. It's a fascinating perspective, and it is hard to imagine someone who can offer it with more historical insight, research expertise, or contagious enthusiasm than our speaker tonight, Ronald White. Ron is a renowned historian and best-selling biographer with 9 authored or edited major works to his name. His recent book, A Lincoln, a Biography, was a New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times bestseller, and was honored as Book of the Year by the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, History Book Club, and Barnes & Noble. His other notable works include Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, and The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words. His op-eds and columns have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Christian Science Monitor. He's lectured at the White House and taught at UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and many other colleges and universities as well. He's also a fellow of the Huntington Library in California, and I am proud to say, a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. Responding to Ron tonight will be Pete Weiner. Pete is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing op-ed writer for the New York Times. Pete writes widely on political, cultural, religious, and national security issues for a broad array of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Affairs, Time Magazine, and the Weekly Standard. He has served in the last 3 Republican administrations, including as the Deputy Director of Speechwriting and later as the Director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, otherwise known as the Office of Strategery in the George W. Bush administration. Pete is also the co-author of the book City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, co-authored with Michael Gerson, and Wealth and Justice, The Morality of Democratic Capitalism with Arthur Brooks. Ron, welcome.
Thank you, each and every one of you who have come out tonight. You have other options. There is another conversation taking place. You probably taped it, but we're glad you're here. Cherie Harder is the president of the Trinity Forum, and as a person honored to serve as a senior fellow, I think I learned to know very quickly she is the right person to lead this dynamic movement. Those of you who know her know the exquisite skill by which she navigates this important venture. I want to also thank my near Malibu neighbor, Pete Peterson. Cynthia and I live in La Cañada, California, and I'm a frequent visitor at Pepperdine basketball games rooting for Gonzaga. But I want to thank you for your co-sponsorship of this event. I've been asked the question many times in recent months, why did I write this book? Well, I wrote American Ulysses for the very same reason that I wrote A. Lincoln. Only once in a while in American history do we encounter the story of an individual who forged through difficult circumstances, often failures, emerges not simply in that person's own individual triumph, but always sensing that the triumph is for a cause larger than themselves. I have put on the screen as you walked in this remarkable lithograph that dates from the 1870s. It's very, very popular in its day, and you see what Americans of that era thought were the 3 great American leaders. Father, martyr, defender. Again and again, to my surprise, I found people in the late 19th century speaking of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. In the year 1900, Theodore Roosevelt was asked to assess who were the great leaders in American history. He said, "Mightiest among the mighty dead loom the 3 great figures of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant." He went on to say of second rank would be Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Andrew Jackson. Now that would take us by surprise. That was the view at the end of the 19th century, the dawn of the 20th century. What happened? What happened was the movement called the Lost Cause began almost immediately at the end of the Civil War, led by Confederate generals. And their argument was that the best side lost, the most Christian side, the most chivalrous side. And then this became part of revisionist teaching, interestingly, in northern universities, but taught by Southern-born historians. And this won the day. It's the story of Gone with the Wind. It's the story of Gods and Generals. It's been very much a part of the way Hollywood has presented the whole story of the Civil War. I'm convinced in the 21st century we need to take a fresh look. It's time to give Grant an upgrade, to see if we can restore him to the place that he once held and should hold again today. If I may, I would like to read to a story. I'm so convinced, as Cherie suggested, that stories often capture the way we can understand a person. The man of middle height, accompanied by a young boy, arrived at the crowded Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station in Washington on a cold, crisp morning. It was March 8, 1864. He hailed a carriage and asked the driver to take them to Willard's Hotel. It was then called Willard's Hotel, not the Willard. I had to correct my copyright person on that. At the northwest corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 14th Street, only 2 blocks from the White House, the man and boy stepped from the carriage and walked directly to the front desk. The man, 42 years old and wearing a travel-stained duster, asked for a room. The clerk sniffed brusquely. Did not the visitor know that in wartime Washington few rooms were available, especially at Willard's, the finest hotel in the nation's capital? The clerk dallied, then informed the traveler he could give them a small room on the top of the floor. That would be fine, the man said softly. The clerk asked the guest to sign the hotel register. When the clerk turned the register around and read the signature, U.S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois, he turned pale. He gasped, "General Grant, why didn't you tell me who you were?" And how many times have we heard that saying in recent decades, "Don't you know who I am?" Peering more closely, the clerk could see that underneath the duster, mostly hidden, was the blue uniform of a Union officer. He had seen posters portraying the hero of the West everywhere in Washington. Suddenly attentive, he blurted out that he was reassigning Grant and his son to Parlor Suite 6, the best in the hotel. Indeed, the same suite Abraham and Mary Lincoln had stayed in 3 years earlier when they arrived in Washington. Now that he knew who was standing in front of him, the clerk handed Grant a sealed envelope. The general opened it, finding an invitation to join President Lincoln at a reception that evening at the White House as the guest of honor. Because he had not served in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War, curiosity about Grant punctuated conversations everywhere. Many knew the outline of his rise to fame, but still they wondered out loud, who was he? How had he succeeded when so many Union generals had failed over the last 3 years? Why had the president elevated him to the position of lieutenant general, the first man since George Washington to hold that rank? Why had Lincoln tapped him to come from the Western Theater to lead all the Union armies? This story for me, as I struggled with the question, how should I begin the book, says so much about Ulysses S. Grant. Self-effacing, not pompous, not claiming right of face, an ordinary person, stepping forward as he always did. Grant almost always wore a private uniform. The only rank, there was no braid on his chest. The only rank that you would know that he was a general were the stars on his shoulders. This was Ulysses S. Grant, which Americans came to love for who he was. If I make Grant an important figure in the Lincoln biography of 2009, I now have to confess I didn't really know the man. And I think most Americans do not really know the man. My friends at the U.S. Grant National Historic Site outside of St. Louis, where he met Julia one day, 9 months after he graduated from West Point, it's a wonderful museum. They say that the visitors arrive with very little knowledge of Grant. How different it is that visitors go to Springfield, Illinois with quite a bit of knowledge of Lincoln. But after walking through the museums, which are actually housed in 2 barns that Grant built for his horses, they emerge with a new understanding, a new appreciation. And that's my goal in writing this biography. But as I dug deeper, I discovered that Grant's life is really a puzzle of many different pieces. First of all, I wanted to understand what he said. He wrote, "I read but few lives of great men because biographers do not, as a rule, tell enough about the formative period of life. What I want to know is what a man did as a boy. Think for yourself how important the years 16, 18, 20, 22. Today, publishers love to market biographies. Many of them are not biographies. They skip very quickly over the young life of the person they're writing about to the adult person who is the general, the president, whomever that person could be. The irony is to look deeply into Grant's life as a young boy. On the frontier of Ohio, where all of his boyhood friends used guns as a matter of course out in hunting, Grant refused to use a gun to hunt. Just like Lincoln, he would not use a gun to kill an animal. He could not do it. How unusual to understand that part of Grant's story. Quickly, I wanted to understand more of Julia. Julia Dent Grant, his wife, this remarkable person has been either maligned or misunderstood. She's been sort of put to the side, and I've tried to bring Julia back into the center of the story. About 4 years ago, a friend of mine, a Hollywood writer and director, approached me and said, "Ron, I think there's the possibility of a television miniseries here." He said, "Could we get together and talk about this?" And so we did at a restaurant in La Cañada where we live. And he said, "Now tell me what you think are some of the most outstanding qualities of Grant." Well, I said, let me start by talking about Julia and this incredible marriage that they held. I mean, people saw them years later in the White House holding hands like they were young teenagers. I said, they had the most remarkable marriage. He shook his head. He said, "That will never do. That will never do." I said, "What?" He said, "That will never do in a television miniseries." I said, "What do you mean?" He always said, "Movies and television are based around internal tension." And I said, "Oh." So a few weeks later, I sent him the first chapters, the early chapters of this biography, and he wrote back and said, "There is internal tension. Don't you see it?" Well, yes, okay. Grant's family, Georgetown, Ohio, were deeply anti-slavery Republicans. Julia Dent's father was deeply pro-slavery. He owned 30 slaves. When the marriage took place in 1848, after the war with Mexico, Grant's parents refused to come to the wedding because he was marrying into a slaveholding family. Julia's father gave her 4 slaves, she called them servants, 4 slaves as a gift for the wedding. And like many young people, I don't think they fully understand that they're part of a larger family structure that they have yet to navigate. Julia Dent Grant. Thank you, Julia. She saved every single one of her husband's letters. And I've had the privilege at the Library of Congress, usually these days you're looking at microfilm, but I've had the privilege of looking at those letters that she preserved. And so Grant, in those letters, says a great deal about his feelings. He doesn't talk about his feelings normally. And it's only to Julia that we get a real sense of the internal character of this man. Like his namesake, Ulysses, Grant struggled after he resigned from the military, serving in Oregon and California in 1854, consumed with despair and loneliness, missing his wife, his first child, his second child, whom he'd never seen, and he came back to try to make a living next door to his father-in-law outside of St. Louis. It was a very difficult time. Economic times were turned against him. And I'll never forget the day when I was at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, and I held in my hand this remarkable document. 3 days before Christmas in 1857, Grant traveled into St. Louis and pawned his gold watch that he could buy Julia a Christmas present. This is the pawn ticket. But Grant just recovered from those. I think the way each of us responds to the difficulties that surely will come in our life say a great deal about who we are. Third part of the puzzle is the question, what about his remarkable friendships? He had this capacity, although soft-spoken, to make friends with people who you might say would almost form an odd couple. And here's the man, William Tecumseh Sherman. Combustible, effusive, ready to move at the drop of a hat. Grant, calm, self-assured. I tried to plumb the question, how is it that these two men became such friends? Grant said to Sherman, "I will come after you no matter what is the obstacle. Be assured I will be there." When Andrew Johnson wanted to supplant Grant as the general-in-chief and appoint Sherman instead, Grant said to Sherman, "I will gladly be your subservient. I will gladly follow you. I will obey your orders." This remarkable friendship between these two men, so totally different in personality, but how did they do it? How did they form that friendship? Finally, I learned that Grant could be understated but decisive, gentle but strong. And what did it mean that Grant was called the hero of Appomattox? He was often called this by people in the South. For although Lincoln had originally said, "I hold in my hand, please remember, all the details for ending this war," when the war ended kind of unexpectedly on that particular Sunday morning, Grant came to meet Lee, and without almost a forethought, he wrote out the magnanimous terms of peace. And then he defended Lee when the war was over, when Johnson wanted to prosecute him for treason. And so Grant becomes the hero of Appomattox. This is his legacy. At his funeral in 1885, there would be 4 pallbearers, the 2 great Union generals, William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, and the 2 great Confederate generals, Joseph Johnson and Simon Bolivar Buckner. They rode together in a carriage, the symbol of what Grant had done to bring people together. Now we have to say, this is part of the puzzle, that Grant, a good judge of character in the military, able to assuage who are the active generals, was not always a good judge of character or morals during his presidency. Why not? Why wasn't he able to see? Why didn't he understand how in this city power can corrupt, and that people who had been very moral persons within the military suddenly found themselves corrupted by the path of power once they came into his presidency? What I liked about him was his willingness to confront his mistakes, to his capacity for self-improvement. Hamilton Fish, I believe, was one of the great secretaries of state of the 19th century. He had retired in New York. He was chairman of the board of Columbia University, an active vestryman in Trinity Church, and Grant asked him to become Secretary of State. He said, I will come for 2 months just to begin the job. He didn't take any permanent lodging here in Washington. He stayed for the entire 8 years, and he became a great fan of Grant as together they sealed the treaty with England that became the foundation for the greatest alliance between these 2 English-speaking peoples. But I was confronted with this question: how could it be that Grant, who finished 21st out of 39 in his West Point class, could become the author, as was suggested in the introduction, of this remarkable memoir? Did we miss something along the road? I have the privilege of working at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. It has one of the great Civil War collections. It has the 3rd greatest Lincoln collection. And one day, a colleague and I found in the bowels of the basement in the library a remarkable find. As Grant traveled to West Point, he dallied, his father thought, for 5 days in Philadelphia. And he wrote a simple sentence back to his father: I went to the theater. We discovered in that volume exactly what plays were showing on exactly what dates in 1839 to say, what were the possibilities? And so I want to resurrect the idea that Grant really is a person of great literary imagination. At West Point, he says, I must apologize. This was an engineering school, a scientific school. He said, I must apologize. I spent my time reading novels. And then, fortunately, he tells us who are the novelists that he read. And he tells us, I read all 11 novels of this person. And then Grant, at the end of his 4 years, is elected president of the Dialectical Society by his fellow West Point graduates, which shows their esteem for him. This is a Grant we don't know. This is the missing portion of the Grant who, at the end of his life, would write his memoirs. Now, I've appreciated the Trinity Forum and its emphasis on character. May I suggest just 3 aspects of Grant's character that I think are worth holding up. The first is what I call his sense of humility, the term used tonight. Often in the 19th century, the term would have been called self-effacement. He wrote to his father as he traveled down to Springfield to begin to discover, could he have a place in the Civil War? This was the first letter he wrote back to his father. I was perfectly sickened at the political wire pulling for all these commissions and would not engage in it. He wrote to William Tecumseh Sherman after he had been elected president in almost the same language. all the romance of feeling that men in high places are above personal considerations and act only from motives of pure patriotism and for the general good of the public has been destroyed. An inside view proves too truly very much the reverse. And so he tells Sherman, I have been forced into it in spite of myself. I could not back down without leaving the contest for power for the next 4 years between mere trading politicians, the elevation of whom, no matter which party won, would lose to us largely the results of this costly war. A second quality that I wish to lift up is Lincoln's own, Grant's own faith journey. I'm saying Lincoln because I traced out very carefully Lincoln's faith journey. I've come to believe, as I am now a wide reader of biographies, is that somehow faith is the presence of the absence, the missing component in recent writing of American biographies. For example, there have been 2 well-received biographies of Dwight Eisenhower in recent years. Neither of them mention the fact that Eisenhower, raised in a kind of an offshoot of the Mennonite tradition as a young man, drifted away, as young people do, from it. And David Brooks mentions in his wonderful book, The Road to Character, that Eisenhower is not a religious person. Well, he learned that from reading these 2 biographies. Unfortunately, that's not true. Dwight Eisenhower was baptized while he was President of the United States. He joined the Presbyterian Church while he was President of the United States. 3 years ago, I had lunch with David Eisenhower at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He told me that in David's conversations with Billy Graham said of all the presidents that he knew, the most profound conversations about faith were with his grandfather, Dwight David Eisenhower. But we don't know that story because for whatever reason, the biographer does not choose to tell it. So it is with Grant. Grant, you read the biographies, there is no faith story. Is the biographer not interested? Does the biographer not have the ability to tease it out? Grant also has a faith story. Almost always the faith story relates to a pastor. Phineas Densmore Gurley was the pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, very instrumental in the life of Abraham Lincoln. Grant had such a person. When Grant moved to Galena in the year before the end of the Civil War, in a very humiliating situation, he was really down and he had to serve under his younger brother in the family leather goods store. But arriving that same year was a young 27-year-old Methodist minister named John Hale Vincent. Grant began to attend the Bench Street Methodist Church. And this person, this is the church, Bench Street Methodist Church in Galena, and John Hale Vincent, who we will see his career, has a tremendous influence on Grant. After Shiloh, Vincent continues a correspondence with Grant, and Grant writes back, I remember the pleasure of listening to your feeling discourses from the pulpit. Feeling discourses, that's Methodism. That's a heart religion, but that's not the way Grant usually talks, feeling discourses. When Grant returned after the Civil War to Galena, he said, I'm going to ask Reverend Vincent to speak for me. Grant was not a good public speaker. Vincent visited him at City Point. He wrote a tremendous epitaph on him on the spirituality of Ulysses S. Grant. We know, if you do know, John Hale Vincent because he became the founder of the great Chautauqua Institution in New York State. And in the second year of Chautauqua, 1875, Grant was now mired in scandal, and he told Julia, we're not going to be doing very much this summer in our home in Long Branch, New Jersey, and the call came from Vincent, would you come to Chautauqua? It would mean so much to help people understand what my mission is. Grant answered the call. He went to Chautauqua, and 20,000 people arrived that weekend. If you've ever been there, it's kind of tucked away in southwestern New York. And Grant was there because of the influence, I believe, of John Hale Vincent. The third quality I want to lift up is the quality of persistence. And may I do that by telling one more story. Grant was brought east to assume command of all the Union armies. And in doing so, he then set in motion what would be called the Overland Campaign, the campaign to move into Virginia to ultimately defeat the Confederate forces. His army left with some trepidation. 4 times the Union Army had advanced into Virginia, and 4 times they had retreated in humiliation. So things did not go well on the first 2 days. They fought in something called the Wilderness. The Wilderness was this terrible place of scrub forest that the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Union Army was totally at loss because men could not even keep track of each other in the darkness. There was very little light that descended in. Artillery was absolutely no use in the Wilderness. And so things did not go well. 200,000 men fought each other in the Wilderness. The Union Army suffered 18,000 casualties in 2 days. Abraham Lincoln, you've seen this scene in the movie Lincoln, was sitting in the telegraph office trying to get in touch with what was going on at the Wilderness. And he could not. And so a congressman asked him, and Lincoln replied, "Well, I can't tell you much about it. You see, Grant has gone to the Wilderness, crawled in, drawn up the ladder, and pulled in the hole after him. And I'm sure he'll have to wait until he comes out before we know what he's up to." Well, Grant had undergone another humiliation when, at the end of the second day, the troops had been saying, "You've never faced Bobby Lee. You've never faced Bobby Lee." A general comes into camp, and the general says, "I know Lee's methods well by past experience. He will throw his whole army between us and the Rapidan River and cut us off completely from our communications." Horace Porter, one of Grant's aides, a wonderful person who wrote a great memoir, observed Grant with a degree of animation that he seldom manifested. And he replied, "Oh, I am heartily tired of hearing what Lee is going to do. Some of you seem to think he's going to turn a double somersault and land in the rear on both of our flanks at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think what we are going to do ourselves." At that moment, no word had gone out from Grant. He had enforced a silence. But several newspaper men said to him, "Don't you think it's important that we get word out?" All the telegraph lines were cut. So one newspaper man said, "I will give $1,000 to anyone who dares to go through the Confederate lines to get back to Washington." 24-year-old Henry Wing took up the offer. He started out, he had not gone very far when someone said, "You're going to be intercepted by the Confederates. Burn your message, change your clothing, and report to them that Lee has just won the battle." So he got to Washington, and he said, "I have a simple message from Ulysses S. Grant. There will be no turning back. There will be no turning back." That became the headline, persistence. And what Lincoln said I thought was remarkable. He said, how many times we have had this thing before and failed. I believe if any other general had been at the head of the army, it would have been on the other side of the Rapidan River. It is the rugged pertinacity, I love Lincoln's language, pertinacity of Grant that wins. So as we draw to a close, why should we be reading Ulysses S. Grant? Several weeks ago, in reading a volume of English history, I came across a remarkable story. The story of a 13-year-old boy who, of ruddy complexion, just starting out in life, who in 1887 asked his parents for a gift for his 13th birthday. That boy was Winston Churchill. He wanted to read Grant's memoirs. 13 years old, he wanted Grant's memoirs as his gift for his 13th birthday. 57 years later, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1944 considered an overture to Germany to perhaps offer them surrender if there could be some sort of conciliation, Churchill wrote a letter to Roosevelt and said, "Do you not remember what Grant told us in 1864? There will be no turning back." And that should be our posture now as we go forward into what would become the last year of the war. My hope in writing this book is that people will once again discover Ulysses S. Grant, not as an unflawed figure, but as a flawed figure who rose not for himself, but as one who was willing to invest his life in a cause greater than himself. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Ron, for that lovely set of reflections on Grant. It's great to be with you. Just a quick word on Cherie Harder. She's a friend. She's actually a former colleague of mine in the 1990s at Empower America, and she's really giving marvelous leadership to this important American organization, the Trinity Forum. I'm struck that we live in a time when there are so many things that are pulling us down, and the Trinity Forum is actually trying to elevate our minds and our hearts, in the words of the psalmist, to lift our eyes to the hills. And that's important to try to do at any moment in the life of a country, but I think it's particularly important to do now. So thank you for that leadership, and thank you to the Trinity Forum for what you're doing. Ron White, I first met in 2002. We had lunch at the White House, and I was Deputy Director of Speechwriting at the time. And Pastor Craig Barnes had put me in touch with Ron, and he was visiting here from California. And we had a delightful lunch. I remember two people we talked about, Lincoln and Jesus, and pretty good company. And I was immediately taken by Ron's love of history, which you've seen, but also his wisdom and his personal grace and his pastoral heart. And when I was head of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, Strategery, which people laugh at from the outside, but in the inside we didn't get the joke. But I guess that's what happens when you worked for George W. Bush. I invited him to speak, Ron, on his book Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, which he did to the White House staff. And then when I was head of OSI, I invited Ron to meet with the president and a group of other authors and historians and public intellectuals. I'm a great fan of President Bush. I was in touch with him this weekend and told him about Ron's book, which he is eager to read. I am standing between you and a conversation with Ron, so I'm not going to take much time. I just wanted to make 2 points related to American Ulysses. The first is it's not only an engaging and beautifully written biography, but it's one of the rare ones that actually reconfigures and recasts how we think about an historical figure, an important historical figure. And that's really what Ron has succeeded in doing with Ulysses Grant. The Grant who emerges from Ron's biography is a far more textured and interesting figure than you may have known him to be. He's a combination of gentleness and strength, generosity and curiosity, a man of modesty and moral courage. He wasn't, as Ron alluded to, a perfect man by any means. His presidency was marred by scandal, although it didn't involve him personally. But a number of the people in his administration were touched by scandal, and that hurt him and it hurt the country. And Reconstruction was hardly the success that one would have hoped for. But Grant was a far more impressive figure than is commonly understood. So in American Ulysses, you'll learn about the time that Grant had at West Point and the Civil War battles, but you'll also learn about his stand for the American Indian and against the KKK, about his very close relationship with Lincoln and his conflicts with Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, and his intimate relationship with a woman he called My Dear Julia. It's actually it's a love story, and it's quite an enchanting one. So I'm glad you were able to resurrect her from the shadows. The second point is that the lessons that Grant can teach us in our time about magnanimity and grace and reconciliation. And to illustrate this, I want to focus on chapter 23, which is titled Appomattox. And Ron writes about this, and this is after the surrender, of course, by General Lee, just a few miles from here. So this is what Ron writes, quote, "As Grant started back to his headquarters, news of the surrender spread like wildfire. Spontaneous firing of salutes exploded everywhere, but Grant immediately sent out an order to stop such demonstrations. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again," end quote. And then Ron goes on to write this, "The Grant who came to make peace at Appomattox had been transformed by 4 years of war, having gained a reputation as a hard war warrior. At Appomattox, he offered a magnanimous peace. Grant assumed a national perspective in writing terms of surrender. The general who began the Civil War with no views of slavery, other than the directives of civilian authorities, at the end of the war, all had transformed into a man who understood the close correlation between war and politics. Lincoln had become his example. Together they chose reconciliation over retribution, unquote. It struck me as I was thinking about what to say of what ran through my mind are the words of Lord Charnwood, who's a Lincoln biographer, as Ron is. Charnwood was born actually during the Civil War, and he said this of Lincoln, Grant's great friend and commander-in-chief: "This most unrelenting enemy to the project of the Confederacy was the one man who had quite purged his heart and mind from hatred or even anger towards his fellow countrymen of the South." And Lord Charnwood went on to write this: "For perhaps not many conquerors and certainly few successful statesmen have escaped the tendency of power to harden or at least to narrow their human sympathies. But in this man, Lincoln, a natural wealth of tender compassion became richer and more tender, while in the stress of deadly conflict he developed an outstanding strength." Now, America is not riven by a civil war today, thankfully, and the apocalyptic pronouncements about modern-day America that we sometimes hear, that we're on the brink of collapse and ruin, strikes me as quite wrong and unwise. But there's no question, I think, that we are deeply divided and polarized, that passions have been inflamed, that political opponents are increasingly viewed as enemies, and more people speak as if we don't share one country anymore. So this is a difficult and dispiriting moment in our national life, in our national political life, and it seems to me we're not getting a lot of help from our political leaders these days. But we can't give way to cynicism. You can maybe believe in theoretical pessimism, but I urge you to choose operational optimism and hope. I'm reminded of what Steve Hayner, who's a beloved friend and spiritual mentor of mine, who died last year, and he told me the last time I saw him, he told me that the central characteristic of God are love and grace, and that therefore the central mission of Christians is to extend the hand of grace to others. What God has given to us, we owe to others. If what you're doing in your life is leading toward reconciliation and redemption, Steve told me, then you're most likely headed in the right direction. And many of us, myself very much included, need to act in ways that lead more toward reconciliation and redemption in our national life. We desperately need that. We needed that in the time of Lincoln and Grant, and we surely need it now. And I think to better understand what that means, we have Ulysses Grant to look to and Ron White to learn from. And so in the next few minutes, it'll be your chance to have the privilege to talk to him about just that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ron and Pete. Good save. This leads us to the most dynamic part of our evening conversation, the conversation part of the evening.
The debate.
Wrong.
It's in the spirit of the political times.
So those of you who have been to evening conversations before know that we have just 3 guidelines for questions. We ask that all questions be brief, secondly, be civil, and finally, that all questions be in the form of a question. So we have a couple of roving mics around here. If you could just raise your hand, be recognized, and wait for the microphone to get to you, you have made it easy on us right there.
Hi, thank you. Absent social media back in the 1900s, how did the perception of Grant change so radically?
The perception changed through a whole reinterpretation of the meaning of the Civil War. Reconstruction was very bad. The lost cause meant that the South was the better cause that lost only because they were outmanned by a much superior force and by the industrial might of the North. And so this view took hold. It's in the history textbooks of the 1910s, 20s, 30s. There was a series on American presidents in 1935 as a biography of Grant. It's just unbelievable. I could have quoted it tonight, sort of saying, Grant was not a good writer. He had no literary skills. I mean, it's hard to believe, but that's how it all happened. And it, you know, Reconstruction began to take a fresh look at that through the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. And even in the last several years, the national parks now have begun to redo our whole understanding of Reconstruction, the riots in Memphis and other places that were just sort of swept under the rug. So that's what happened, and that's what happens again and again in history, and why we have to revisit persons and events in each generation.
I just wanted to say, having read the book, because I'll defer obviously to Ron on this, is that it struck me that in the reconciliation that things that didn't go well were in spite of what Grant did rather than because of. And I think historically there was a sense that he was the reason for it. But your chapter, and you know, with the Ku Klux Klan and this enormously complicated task that he had with Reconstruction, which was on the one hand to try and bring the South back, and yet on the other hand this very deep commitment to justice and the cause of blacks, and trying to balance that out, and then having to deal with his own party that was splitting. So it was a very complicated task. Again, I learned this really in reading the book.
Just a quick example, I'm going to keep the answers short. A young woman, Ann Marshall, has recently written a book on Kentucky, and her argument is that Kentucky joined the Union during the Civil War and immediately joined the Confederacy after the war was over. All the leaders of Kentucky were former Confederate generals.
Questions right there.
Thank you. I was struck by your reference early in your talk to Grant's disinclination as a young boy to use a weapon with animals. Mm-hmm. In the Western campaigns during the Civil War, he was known for a readiness to suffer large numbers of casualties in the battles. In his first faith journey, how did you see him sort of coming to grips with this?
Very good question. First of all, we have to maybe distinguish or maybe declaim the understanding this is part of the lost cause, that Grant suffered far more casualties than Lee. Our greatest Civil War historian, James McPherson, has shown, as have others, that this is absolutely untrue, that Lee suffered far more casualties than Grant did per the size of his units. And so when Grant went on his world tour, you and I began to talk about that before, he visited Bismarck in Berlin, and Bismarck commended him for being this great general and warrior and stuff, and he said, I'm not a warrior at all. I absolutely hate war. I absolutely hate it. I only went to war to save the Union. That's what I had to do. And the minute the war was over, I didn't want to have anything more to do with that kind of ferocity. So this is a hard thing for us to understand, but how someone would do what he felt was necessarily what became called the hard war, but both Lincoln and Grant were then advocates of what they called a soft peace. And what we fail to recognize is that when Lincoln was assassinated, we actually have the conversations of Republican leaders saying, in effect, we are glad that he is no longer alive because he is too soft. He is too soft, and now we can go forward and we're going to punish the South.
Right up here.
Related to the first question that was asked, I was just curious. So I understand how this version of Grant came into being. It makes some sense to me. What makes less sense to me is why, I mean, even 1935, it was 80-something years ago, why is sort of this reevaluation, why did it take so long?
A very good question. One of the reasons that that particular author, who was a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, a very esteemed person, did not understand it is we had then not collected the Grant papers. They were all over the place. And so the purpose of putting the Grant papers together only began in 1962. And I'm the first person who's had the privilege of looking at all 33 volumes of the Grant papers. And so all of these misunderstandings of Grant began to change when we began to have all of his orders, his letters to Julia. This put in place a completely new understanding. And actually the final volume, The Grant memoirs will be published by Harvard University Press in 2017, an annotated version, which will just be wonderful so that we can see the absolute miraculous nature of his doing this while he is racing death to finish this.
We'll go over here.
Hi, my question is on Grant's personal views of slavery. And I've not yet had the pleasure of reading the book, though I will do so shortly. I just picked it up. But based on the book, Mr. Weiner mentioned that before the Civil War, Grant did not have serious views on slavery. And in his own memoirs, he paints a very different picture, saying that he himself supported, John Brown in everything except military tactics. And even though he doesn't go into it, he doesn't mention owning a slave, but at the same time he was pawning his watch. He refused to sell his slave, as I understand it. He freed him. But is this a after-the-fact portrayal of his views towards slavery in the war?
It's a very good question and comment. If you went to the U.S. Grant National Historic Site, in their new film, they begin with the remarkable story of Grant deciding in 1859 to free his slave, William. The slave probably would have brought $1,000. Grant was really down. He refused to accept any money, but rather signed a document of manumission, but he says nothing about it. And so during the Civil War, early on, in various letters and responses to orders, he says something like, I don't really have a particular view on this, but I am willing to follow whatever the view is. He was very deferential to civilian authority. My argument is that then as he travels further and further into the Deep South, he begins to experience this firsthand, and he begins to become a vigorous defender of the rights of the freedmen. Not simply as a general in the Civil War, but as he watches Andrew Johnson and then even Republicans in Congress begin to distance themselves from this, he steps forward to do something, even been told by members of his own cabinet, this is very unpopular what you're doing. I understand that, but I must do it. We must defend the rights of the freedmen.
Right here. Oh, right there, John.
Dr. White, you mentioned the phrase soft peace. I want to talk about the hard war, ask you about the hard war.
Yes.
S.C. Gwynn, in his biography of Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, links General Grant with Jackson in the sense that he says Grant and Jackson were early ahead of their time in recognizing that the Civil War had to be so brutal for both sides that one side would sue for peace. Do you agree with Gwynn's characterization of Grant? Like, did he believe in a brutal war so that it would end quickly?
I don't know that I'd use the word brutal, but what happened in this evolution is early on Grant was very much trying to police his own men who were doing pretty terrible things to the civilians. Then we discover that the civilians are civilians by day and bushwhackers by night, and they are snipers killing his Union forces. So he becomes part of a policy which is really a national policy. It's generated in Washington, not generated by him, that becomes this hard war. I think it's not quite the war of Sherman, but it is certainly a war that we must do everything we can to end this war as quickly as we can, and then we will have peace. And what Pete read, I'm glad he did, the idea that he stopped all the celebrations and said, these men are now our brothers again. So yes, he was a part of the hard war.
Questions right there.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
In light of Grant's character, is there any way for us to gauge what he might have said to the political campaign of 2016?
I remember David McCullough being asked that question in an event I attended in Pasadena, and he said, I'm an historian. In the wonder of publishing, first this book was going to be published on Father's Day, and then it was going to be published in September, and then it's going to be published in October. I think it is quite remarkable that it is being published 1 month before our presidential election. So if the values and the qualities of Grant, as I hope they are seen once upon a time, we had civility, we had respect, These are values. Can we bring them back into the political process? I do hope that this biography can contribute to that conversation.
Pete, you have thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, Pete, you join that. You've written about this very well.
I do. I just won't share them. Yeah. No, I was struck. I mean, I must say, just in reading about Grant, and I've read Ron on Lincoln and others, and Lincoln to me is the sort of great figure in American history and one of the great figures in history at all. It's not just the civility, which I think is important enough, but it's a certain conception of what politics actually is about. It was actually a rather high view of what politics is about. They weren't Pollyannas, and they knew, like the founders, they knew what human nature was. And the genius of the founders was that they set up a system of government that conformed to what both the virtues and the vices in human beings. But they did believe that politics was about the human good ultimately, and as Madison says in the Federalist Papers, it's about justice. And I think on some deep level, Grant knew that. That really was what informed a lot of, I think, his views, both toward the American Indian and toward as I mentioned earlier, the Ku Klux Klan, the Freemen. Was this idea of justice kind of at the core of what America should be, an imperfect nation, but was on a road to try and become a more perfect union. And of course, that was central to Lincoln as well. And today, it's quite discouraging because I don't think that you've got very many people who are in politics that seem to convey any sense of the higher purposes of politics and aren't willing to defend it, and actually are in the very process of tearing it apart and tearing it down. So I imagine that if some of these figures from history were here now, they would actually say this is a pretty precious legacy that we've been given, and you can lose it. Maybe after you've had it for a long time, there's a sense that this is just self-perpetuating and you can never lose what you've gained, but you actually can. I think that's probably a deeply conservative view. And that it'd be nice if there were a few people in politics that were able to articulate the fundamental purposes of it, because that's not happening now, and that I think is part of the explanation. It's very complicated for the kind of rampant cynicism that we see. I'm not big on cynicism.
Lots of hands all of a sudden. Johnny Lift, front row.
What does Grant's initiatives in the Vicksburg campaign tell you about Grant's character?
The Vicksburg campaign was the longest, by far, military campaign. There were a lot of starts and stops, a lot of things that didn't seem to work, and all the while Grant's reputation was going down as people were incredibly impatient as to what was taking place. I finally visited Vicksburg about a year ago, and it's a very complicated territory there, a very difficult terrain, great resources for those who are defending it. But I think it shows Grant's willingness not simply to be persistent, what I mentioned earlier, but his willingness to change his mind, to move to a new strategy when one doesn't work. The Vicksburg campaign is most remarkable because he couldn't get below the batteries of this defended city, Vicksburg. Finally they did, and he decided to approach the city from the south, but not directly. He didn't want to encounter an army that might block his way. So in 5 different battles, he went northeast instead of Vicksburg going over here northwest. And most remarkable was at the end of the battle, July 4, 1863, Abraham Lincoln writes him a letter. Now, must remember that Abraham Lincoln had become terribly, terribly discouraged with George Meade's inability to follow up Gettysburg and to go after Lee, who was in desperate straits. And Lincoln got angrier and angrier and angry as Meade waited. Finally, 14 days later, he went after Lee, and Lee had just crossed over the Potomac River back into Virginia. So Lincoln sets out and writes this letter, and he just says, I want you to know, And in wonderful part of Abraham Lincoln, we find in the Lincoln Papers, never signed, never sent. He understood he would destroy George Meade if he wrote that letter. How many politicians could say, never signed, never sent to that last email? Then he wrote a letter to Ulysses S. Grant, and he says, I believe we've never had the privilege of meeting before, and I want to simply say, when you decided to do this, I thought that was wrong. When you made that decision, that was surely incorrect. When you did that, I didn't agree with that at all. And at the end of the letter, Lincoln says to Grant, I want to simply say I was wrong, and you were right. Sincerely, A. Lincoln. Now that's part of politics too.
Right, Jeff, second row, John.
I'm just curious with the Civil War, the program was Ken Burns.
Yes.
What do you think of the portrayal of Lincoln that occurred in that? Because many of us probably are Grant. That is our memory of Grant. I'm curious what your take on that, Ken Burns' take on Grant was.
You know, I'll have to go back and look at, I was so caught up at the time in Ken Burns' portrayal of Lincoln, which I think had a great deal to do with a whole new understanding and appreciation. If I could shift it in a way, how many of you have seen the movie Lincoln? Well, we all know, I think, and would agree that the characterization of Lincoln and Mary Lincoln and Seward is great. Can anybody tell me who Grant is in the movie? Absolutely undefined. He's undefined in the movie. He's the figure that just kind of waltzes through the movie, chomping on his cigar, and we don't really know who this person is. That's another challenge. It isn't simply that Grant has sometimes been called the drunkard, as he has, or the butcher. He often stands there kind of undefined, as he is in the movie Lincoln. And I think what we're trying to do here is to give him some definition. And that's important in restoring his place in American history.
Chris, over here, second row.
Thank you very much for tonight. You mentioned earlier that Winston Churchill was influenced by Grant. Were there any other leaders that were influenced by him?
At Grant's death, Westminster Abbey decided to hold its own concurrent memorial service. They could not accommodate all the people who wanted to come to the service in London. They had to turn people away. Why? Well, most of our American presidents come to the office with very little experience in foreign affairs, and that included Grant. So when Grant left office in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes had been elected, Grant decided to take a tour as a private citizen. He arrived in Liverpool, and to his surprise, he was a national celebrity. He spoke to working men in northern England, and 60,000 working men came from the mines and the mills to spend tribute to him. And so this brief tour of England and perhaps Europe became 26 months of traveling around the world. When he got to China, the leader of China said, we have this big dispute going on with Japan over these contested islands. I know you're going to Japan. Would you be willing to be a mediator between China and Japan? When he got to Japan, the leader of Japan said, we would be happy to have you be a mediator between us. So in an interesting kind of way, Grant was probably more prepared to be president when he returned than he before. We don't know the story of that tour. It was called at the time a boondoggle. What's he doing? Just traveling around. He traveled as a private citizen. I call him our American ambassador. He had such stature in the world, not simply in the United States.
Right there.
Ron, could you speak about Grant's faith journey, how defined it was, if it was defined, how visible it was, if it was visible?
Thank you, Kathy. Grant's faith journey is not as profound as Abraham Lincoln, but there is a faith journey. He's the son of a Methodist family. Julia's grandfather was a Methodist minister. She loved to play the hymns of Charles Wesley on the piano that had been given to her by a dear friend. John Hale Vincent was the pastor in Galena, and I think became kind of a spiritual mentor to Grant all the way through the war. The first national church built in Washington was not the National Cathedral. It was the Metropolitan Methodist Church. They started to build this church in 1852. Things got slowed down, slowed down by the Civil War. When Grant was elected president, things speeded up. And so that church was dedicated 4 days before Grant was inaugurated as President of the United States. Grant served as a trustee. Julius served as the chairperson of the Person to Retire the Building campaign. On the first Christmas Eve, Grant participated in the service and burned the deed for the church. At the beginning of his second term, he wrote to every member of his cabinet. This didn't quite make it into the book, Caitlin, but we know why. Couldn't do everything. He wrote to every member of his cabinet and said, I think we ought to rededicate ourselves. And I suggest we all attend church together at the Metropolitan Church. He wrote to Hamilton Fish and said, you'll really like our pastor. He preaches great sermons. Let's come together and dedicate ourselves as we start the second term together. So there is a faith journey there that has been invisible in our American history. I wanted to bring it out.
In the back.
You mentioned how much Grant wanted peace as he went through the war as a general. Did he have any plans or ideas to run for office or to work to achieve peace in that capacity after the war?
Well, early on, even in the war, as people were turning against Lincoln, people began making overtures to him in 1864 that he would become a candidate for President of the United States and replace Lincoln on the Republican ticket or perhaps on the Democratic ticket. And right away, he wrote to various different inquiries saying, I have absolutely no desire to do this. I'm not interested in political office. I'm not a political person. This is not who I am. So this was not who he wanted to be. And early on, when he began to serve the administration of Andrew Johnson, he went to a rally at Cooper Union. And quickly, people began to cheer Grant, 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 Grant. He left the rally. He did not want to take away from the centrality of Andrew Johnson, who was President of the United States. This was so characteristic of who he was. I think he ran for president because Johnson was such a disaster and that someone had to step forward to carry on the vision of Abraham Lincoln. Otherwise, I don't think he would have done that.
He even said in his first inaugural that he said that this is an office that has come by me, not quite by accident, you'll remember, but it was one that he did not seek, and he seemed not to have any real ambition for it.
And even the second term, he said, you will recall that I did not seek this office, nor do I seek it again. He would not campaign. He would not vote for himself for President of the United States.
Any additional comment on that, Pete?
It's our different times. Right?
Cynthia, front row.
Ron, would you say a few words about the circumstances under which Grant wrote his final memoirs and the role of Mark Twain?
Thank you very much. I planted that question. No, that's my wife. I wanted to honor the 30 minutes. Grant had no intention of writing his memoirs. During President Dwight David Eisenhower, 8 years, one memoir was written by one cabinet officer. How many memoirs were written under George W. Bush and Barack Obama before either of them ever completed their office? And why did he not want to write it? Because these are I'll get you memoirs. Let me tell my side of the story. Let me put my opponent down. He was even critical of Sherman's memoir, published in 1875 because it was that kind of a memoir. But then everything changed. Grant lost all of his money in a Ponzi scheme on Wall Street, of which his son was a partner, and the son's partner went to jail. Then Grant retired to Long Branch, his summer resort, struck a pain in his throat. The doctor who he was to see traditionally spent 4 months in Europe, so he didn't see the doctor till October. He was diagnosed with throat cancer. Now he was ready to write his memoir. He was offered by the Century magazine $10,000 to write his memoir. Mark Twain heard about this and rushed over to Grant's house. And in Mark Twain's typical language, he said, $10,000? That's what we would pay an unknown Comanche Indian to write his memoir. He said, you don't realize it, but your memoir will sell 300,000 copies. He said, well, he's very loyal. He said, I can't back out of my contract with Century. Yes, you can, said his son, Fred. And so he signed on, and Twain said, I'll publish it with my own publisher, and I won't give you 10%, which was the standard royalty. I'll give you 70% of the total profits. And so Twain stood by him. Grant was now racing death. There's a phenomenal passage in there where everybody thinks that Grant has died. And Twain writes this amazing thing in his journal that every single town across the United States will ring 63 bells for the 63 years of Grant's life. That is how much this man is revered across this nation. So Twain did publish the memoirs. He did give Julia $450,000 of 19th century money. There were no presidential pensions till Harry S. Truman. And it's the only memoir that has never been out of print. It's the gold standard of memoirs, not simply president. It's not a presidential memoir, it's more a military memoir. It's wonderful.
And he wrote it himself.
Although people thought Mark Twain wrote it.
Can you just tell people why it is considered such a magnificent work?
It is a magnificent work because it puts you, the reader, into the situation. He tells the story of battling Robert E. Lee, and it's almost like he says at one point, I feared I would wake up that morning and Lee would be escaped and move forward. He learns to eschew adverbs and adjectives. He learns to focus with adverbs. It is not about himself. He gives amazingly wonderful portraits of all the central figures of the Civil War, including George McClellan, who he says, I think is unfairly criticized. He gives a tremendous word portrait of Abraham Lincoln and why he is the most compelling figure of this war. So I've had lots of people in recent months tell me how much they've enjoyed reading Grant's memoirs. It's really terrific, and he was writing this as he was dying of cancer.
We'll take two more quick questions. Quinn.
I was hoping I'd be last. So 3 books on Lincoln, 1 on Grant. What's next?
Oh my goodness, I was chatting with Cherie and with Cynthia about that this morning. I'm not really quite sure. I would like to do a book. I think it's words matter. And they mattered for Lincoln in terms of his speeches, and they mattered for Grant in terms of his writing. And I would like to find a figure for whom words matter. I'd like to find a figure for whom there's a faith story. And that's what I'm looking for, that particular person. I call it my Wright Brothers book. If you've read David McCullough's wonderful book on the Wright Brothers, I'd like to write up a person who we know, we think we know, but we don't really know. So if you have any candidates.
Last question. We'll go right there.
It's unusual to find a general and a statesman, a conqueror and a healer. Yeah. And I'm thinking of Eisenhower and Marshall on the one hand, and Grant, but Grant seemed to be much more impactful. Why would you say? What were the unique traits that brought that about in him?
Well, I've thought about the fact that when was the last time we elected a general as president? You talk about the change in the political climate. We are a product of the Vietnam going forward. We struggle with the wars that we've been a part of, but somehow in that generation and throughout the 19th century, this was not at all unusual to elect a general to be president. And Grant had a steep learning curve. He thought he could originally lead as a nonpartisan figure. He didn't want to be the head of the Republican Party. And then after a couple of years, I must become the head of the Republican Party. He very much wanted the Republican Party to have a role in the South, which it was losing. He spent a lot of time in the South. So he didn't have the reputation of Sherman. He had a very different reputation with people in the South. So Grant learned on the job how to become president. And his basic skills came forward, but there were also the demerits. And I don't want to minimize those demerits. Yeah.
Pete, any final thoughts to add?
No, it's a lovely book. And if you like history, you'll like this book, and you'll learn about Grant, who who was a great soul, so we need to read more of those.
The cover of the book, if you decide to look at it or to purchase it, is very interesting. It's an 1864 photograph that Random House colorized. And I love the way they did it. You see Grant's eyes, and it's almost as if you're looking into the soul of this man. And that was my purpose. I want to write from the inside out, not simply what a person did, but who they are. That, to me, is really important in understanding figures of the past.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Pete. There will be copies of American Ulysses on sale just right out there. Ron will be signing books, so if you buy them tonight, you're going to be able to have him sign your book for you. You also should have an invitation on your chair that I want to bring to your attention, and that is to join the Trinity Forum Society. We aim to make possible discussions like this to provide a space for thoughtful leaders to wrestle with what matters most in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and warmly hospitable. Your membership and your involvement helps make evenings like this possible, and so we really hope that you will avail yourself of that opportunity. In addition, there are other benefits to membership as well. One of them is a subscription to our quarterly readings, and I'll point out just 2 readings. Our fall reading, which just came out, actually features an essay by George Orwell, Politics in the English Language. We've been talking a lot tonight about why words matter, and this essay goes to the heart of that. There's also an introduction by our very own Pete Weiner. And one of our other readings, Abraham Lincoln, The Spiritual Growth of a Public Man, also includes a preface by Ron White. So all Trinity Forum Society members get our quarterly readings, our monthly podcast interviews with different thought leaders around the world, as well as our daily curated reading feed of excellent works that we recommend to you. Finally, as a special bonus, if you join the Trinity Forum Society tonight, we will give you a free copy of Ron's book, so you can avoid the line, go straight to the other table and get your copy there, so we commend that to you. In addition, I hope that you will join us for other such evening conversations. The next Trinity Forum evening conversation is going to be November 14th in the room next door. It'll be on finding meaning in pain and suffering. And our next event in partnership with Pepperdine School of Public Policy will be this spring. More details will be forthcoming, and so we hope that you will join us for that. Finally, it is always appropriate to end with thanks. There are many people who have made tonight possible. It has been really not only a pleasure, but even a joy to work with Pete Peterson and to work with Pepperdine in bringing this series to you. We're grateful for their involvement, their sponsorship, and their friendship. And also just wanted to thank the other sponsors who have participated tonight: the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, the National Presbyterian Church, and the Lincoln Group of D.C. Finally, I'd like to thank some of the people who have been down in the trenches in making tonight happen. Our photographer, Zach Miller, volunteer, Hannah Wolf, my own fantastic colleagues at the Trinity Forum, Colleen O'Malley, our Director of Advancement, Membership and Events Director, Alyssa Abraham, and Office Manager, Ashley White Brothers, as well as our fearless interns, Nancy Ritter and John Huff. Finally, thank you again to our thoughtful and eloquent speakers, Ron White and Pete Weiner. Thank you to each of you for coming, and good night.